What's up, guys? Welcome back to Here for the Truth. I'm Joel Rafidi. Got my co-host Erasmus with me. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching wherever you're consuming this. Today we see the return of Hector Combo. Wanted to get Hector back on at this particular pertinent time with a very interesting and very complex geopolitical situation. I think the takes and the perspectives that he offers are incredibly deep, incredibly nuanced, and are rare, very, very, very rare to find. So if this is something that you're interested in, I think you're going to get a lot of value in terms of trying to understand some of the deeper mechanisms at play as to why we find ourselves where we are today and what's really going on beyond just a surface level truther look at geopolitics. Yeah. Right before we get Hector on, Rise Above the Herd, our 10-week group coaching program. I think there is, by the time this comes out, there will be 2 days or less to apply. So if you're listening to this early in its release, you can head to riseabovetheherd.co and apply for one of the final spots of Rise Above the Herd. We've said a lot on this. Basically, this is our self-work program to get you to live a life that is deeper connected to who you really are. And we've had tremendous success previously. All right, guys, enjoy this episode.
You are now listening to the Here for the Truth podcast, hosted by Joel Rafidi and Gerasimos.
I'll probably be nodding a lot during this episode while you speak.
Well, at least your hair looks nice.
I'm not wearing a hat, bro. It's been like a few episodes in a row I'm not wearing my hat, you know?
It looks okay. I mean, he's being very, very complimentary. He's being very complimentary with that.
Is it because I didn't say something about your hair?
This is bedhead.
You also have very nice hair.
Joel always feels bad with
my hair. You mentioned my hair as soon as you jumped on. What are you talking about?
Listen, this is typical Joel. If someone says something nice about me, immediately after, someone needs to say something nice to him, you know?
This is all going in the episode, just so you guys know.
Oh, wow. It says this meeting is recorded.
Yeah.
It's the hound dog. Hound dog compliments.
Hector Combo is back. Round number 3. He's an individualist on a mission to bring forth his inner truth and light. Prolific alternative writer, researcher, and thinker, blending and bridging many worlds and schools of thought together, including psychology, philosophy, conspiracy, geopolitics, occultism, and more. His first 2 episodes with us are The Technocratic Age, Part 1 and Part 2. They are episodes 85 and 116. You guys can go check that out. Welcome back, man. How's things?
Pretty good. Very resounding introduction there. I appreciate you for having me on. I look forward to having this spontaneous conversation.
Yeah, bro. Absolutely. Me too, man. I guess just to kick things off, we're in a very interesting time in, the geopolitical landscape that we're witnessing around us. We have assassination attempts, supposedly on presidents. We're 1 month from the election. We have things ramping up in the Middle East again. I guess just a first overall synopsis from you, like as a general basis on any thread that we can pull in this arena, like what are you seeing unfold?
That the trajectory of today's political dilemma is encapsulated as the current thing. So there's a geopolitical strategy to create tension and demoralization, but it's not just the Yuri Bezmenov idea. It's actually an intended effort to catapult a bigger myth and hijack mythos. And in order to do that, you will literally have to betray the ideal within people's ideology. And the fomentation of that overall plan didn't happen today. So I wrote an article about a series of events, and most people, as they want to believe that they're going to wake up, they return to business as usual because they're not actually awakening in a series of awakenings. They're simply being prompted to respond to the current thing. And so when you tell a story, half of the story can actually affect one segment of the population, and the other can also create a Hegelian dialectic. I don't want to make it too complicated, but I want to say that the takeover of the United States and in other countries didn't happen overnight. It's not something that just because conservatives are talking about the communist takeover that it happened yesterday. This was an ongoing decade of serious political infiltration, and we have to break it down. And a lot of the times we get caught with the names and the places, which dilute the overall reasoning behind it. So I look forward to exploring that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to break it down a little more because I think this is something that people pay lip service to, and I have to say, I think that one of the videos I've shared most in the world the last 5-10 years has been the Yuri Bezmenov, G. Edward Griffin interview, because I just feel like it highlights a lot in terms of, you know, the timeline. I mean, we're looking at an interview from 1984 that explains things that feel like they're going on right now. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that. You know, how did this all happen? You know, obviously it's longer than just like a 90-minute podcast. You could just touch on it, but I feel like we could unravel that a little bit, because again, people throw these words out. Oh, socialist. Oh, communist. This politician's a fucking commie. Like what happened?
So in the 20th century, there was a major awakening towards individual rights, property, and also the advancement of technology. In connection to that was also the technocratic elite, the owners and the bankers of society, who've discovered that the abstract scientific models can predictably control people's reality. And they had hired someone like Edward Bernays, which was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud saw his work being bastardized and taken to control the irrational impulses of society in order to service the managerial class, the technocratic elite. It was not only Edward Bernays. There was an ongoing conversation from all these different cities, so like the city of Vienna, the city of Paris, and so on, the city of London, New York. And a lot of these thought-provoking philosophers and psychologists had different ideas of what it meant to run and manage a society. And one of the aspects that I focused during my ongoing research is the German democracy, Weimar Republic, and the impact of the First World War. Why is that symbolic? It's more than just symbolic, it's talismanic. It basically broke the human heart. And in fact, Sigmund Freud saw the First World War as a way to confirm that society is not based on any real sane principle of organization, but simply a facade. Well, that was his realization. Other realizations come from Erich Fromm and the Frankfurt School. This is where, to your point about a lot of people using labels and truisms as political slogans to counteract the current thing. The current thing is just what people are limited to paying attention. They don't actually get to the genealogical origin of things. So for example, in the Frankfurt School, they were interested to know how the German worker and in general people were able to support the populist uprising of Nazism. So they psychoanalyzed Hitler, they psychoanalyzed people in the movement, and they deemed that the structures of supposed modern society basically are like a necrotic attack on the vitality of people. Those are just my words. It's my understanding, not their particular understanding. So there was a whole nexus of the Frankfurt School that were material dialectical people. They thought that the material conditions of reality mean more than the ideas of reality. So in other words, while we may have ideals about reality, those ideals are not necessarily the conditioning factors that create the individual. And Erich Fromm, in his book, To Have or To Be, he basically deconstructs the idea of possessing an identity and creating a new self. And in the modern age, because we cannot go back to the Reformation, we cannot go back to the medieval times and realize what happened, what we lost. They are very suspicious of technology, very suspicious of society in sociology and religion and politics. So they were deemed to be people who understood the psychoanalysis of modern men. But Erich Fromm was not the only individual in the Frankfurt School. In fact, he was kicked out as he was developing his ideas. And basically his ideas was conducting surveys. What are people thinking and feeling? And how can you predict that outcome of a political society? He was doing that research. Anyway, the Frankfurt School, through financial starvation and through different tactics within their university system, they kicked out Erich Fromm and gave more of a reign to Herbert Marcuse. Now, Herbert Marcuse, Habermas, and others were essentially the creators of the critical race theory. They were the creators or the promulgators of critical theory. But there's more than that. There's also Adorno, who was also a musician and saw jazz music as some aberration. Now, one thing we have to understand is we're not just dealing with individuals and their ideas, we're dealing with the context of the landscape. So most of the actual people that left Germany emigrated to the United States or emigrated to Israel. This is very important to today's political reality. Not only did they infiltrated corporations and institutions and universities, they partnered themselves with government, private-public partnerships. And the State Department was actually trying to figure out which particular societies of philosophy and sociology they will fund and co-opt. So Herbert Marcuse was actually followed by the FBI. And around that time, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, there's a whole political resurgence of what it means to be individuals, such as Ayn Rand and others who thought about what the individual aspect of civilization was primal, was the main thing to foster, because it was the individual who developed the processes and the productivity to make everything run. Well, other collectivist agents from the Frankfurt School who partnered with the government, they were trying to use a different psychoanalysis, and they were promulgating this false liberation. Obviously, they didn't call it that, but they were seeking to liberate people into pleasures, into the principle of pleasure. And they saw Americans as a one-dimensional creature. The one thing that we're actually feeling today is the outcome of the first, second, and third generations of the Frankfurt School. A lot of the people who talk about cultural Marxism, or those who believe in the idea of liberation based on LGBTQ rights, don't really understand the original manuscripts and the original philosophers that talked about this. So, for example, in different schools of philosophy, like in Princeton and others, they had these discussions in 1980s or in 1990s where they were talking about what it meant to be free. Are we going to create a free society based on pleasures, or are we going to create a society based on a deeper mechanism of unfolding the individual self? Well, they started talking about it, but that was still filtering out throughout the student uprisings, the hippie movement, and all these other different contingent activist movements. The sloganism, the truisms, came from the idea of liberating humans to just simply satiating desires, and that's what was the outgrowth of just the ideological front. That's one aspect of it. But the interconnected issues are also the politics of power, because we have to talk about the politics of power. There's not only the coercive fraud and the monopoly on violence that is the state, there's also the scientific application of power. That's why a lot of people such as Eric Fromm saw it with suspicion. You can say Michel Foucault also was integral in deconstructing this whole idea of power politics in the institutions, in the academia. This to say that there are well-meaning people who do believe in these ideas, but they're kicked out, and they're kicked out through what I think his name is Horkheimer, what he said to be financial starvation. You don't pay them any money. You exclude them. You only work with the people that you can trust. And at that time, I'm just giving an encapsulated history of around 1940s, 1960s, 1980s. So it's like coming back and forth. It's not just necessarily naming the patterns, but the school of thoughts that infiltrated the United States and were also connected to Bolshevik Russian revolutionaries and the mafia. And if we understand what happened in the Spanish Civil War, we'll understand about fifth column groups. So the Spanish Civil War was basically an international staging for the Second World War. The idea is that there's international interests, powerful groups who are funding and training paramilitary groups and inserting them. But it doesn't actually, the hijack of a country or a society doesn't necessarily start with the coercive power of paramilitary terrorist groups. It first starts off with the altruistic. It starts off first with the ideas of we're here to help you, we're here to liberate you, and people in earnest take into that ideal. And then ideology is formed, and ideology is a betrayal of ideals. It's a systematic approach of betrayal and coercion and fraud. So that's where we find ourselves. But to get deeper into this, we have to understand that there was a major conversation in the 20th century between individualism and collectivism. And the unfortunate thing is that collectivism, through sheer will to power, was the dominating force of the 20th century, which sets really the staging for the 21st century.
Well said, man. I appreciate how your mind works and how you synthesize and integrate, obviously so much that you've learned and that you've observed in the world. And you're speaking my language, especially around the collectivism versus individualism.
I want to touch on, so what was the purpose of the Frankfurt School?
Okay, so the actual purpose of the Frankfurt School is to figure out what component of the German psyche allowed for a Hitlerian authoritarian society to take place. It's a think tank, and they were trying to answer the question, how did Nazi come about? How did Nazi Germany become into existence? And they started tracing it into some of the fundamental ideas of what it feels in essence to be a German. And some of those ideas, I didn't just get from Erich Fromm. I also followed into Tragedy and Hope, Carol Quigley's conversation of what is the difference between the German identity and the English and the French identity. So it originates from that point of perspective.
And what did they, I guess, ultimately discover in that?
That the authoritarian personality, they discovered the idea of the authoritarian personality. In their view, and especially in the book Escape from Freedom, he starts talking about how capitalism, in essence, is a way to commodify the identity of a being, the identity of a self. And that the very same structures that made Nazism as a powerful state was essentially scientific rationalism and the assembly line. These things are not necessarily communist. They're more of a technocratic industrial revolution. And there was these different political models that were trying to absorb that reality, the industrial revolution, and appropriate that into a system in which people will conform and become automatons. That's what Erich Fromm deconstructs as being the authoritarian personality. But then we have to be really cautious about it, because the people that came into that awareness of the authoritarian personality, in essence, started blaming the middle class Americans as being authoritarians. So really, they're just trying to figure out what is the personality that created this big, bizarre Hitlerian event in our history.
Yeah, it's interesting correlation when we see, far right, the word far right being thrown around to people who are probably more centric minded, 10, 15 years ago. And this rise of, labeling people as authoritarian today, now in America.
Right, because it's been an ongoing conversation, and we can go back to John Dewey, or we can go to other people of American political ideas, but it originates also too with anarchism, because one of the bigger things about anarchism is that the whole coercive system, the monopoly on violence, is created by an authoritarian personality. Well, the question follows, how can you define an authoritarian? How can you define someone that is concretely, objectively an authoritarian personality? Well, it's very difficult, because once you get into the milieu of the cultural context, it all really depends on context. And for me personally, to really define someone as an authoritarian, really, I would want to see what their opinion on violence, what their opinion on the government is, and especially how they raise their kids. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the questions that was not examined in some of these false liberation theology. They want to examine all the structures of power, but then they themselves become authoritarians because they have a suspicious mind.
Yeah. I don't really want to dive too deep into this for obviously this conversation. You can share what you want. There seems to be a more of a popular movement these days of people like questioning certain elements of World War II and the Holocaust, etc. And I'm just curious from your research, is there any merit to the questioning, or do you think there's something else behind it?
Well, we have to psychoanalyze people in general before we enter into it. And one of the things that I love about Erich Fromm is that he does psychoanalyze people who seem to take that for granted, that idea of questioning reality, questioning history. And really we've developed a system, a hyper-real normalized system of always seeking the truth behind the truth behind the truth. And in order for us to do that, we're looking for something that will grab our mind and our attention, but there's a deeper complex, our impotence. So we're trying to seek in the past through nostalgia and some resentment, some idealistic hero. When you actually look at Hitler, he betrayed his people, he betrayed the Nazi party after the whole idea. So we have to actually look into it. The book, The People's War, the first socialized war, is Iron Steel. I forget the name of the author. But in the whole series of events that happened, they had a critical opportunity, both the Nationalist Workers' Party, they had a critical opportunity to really redefine their culture, their citizenry, and their place in the world. And because of the whole tension between America, England, and France in the whole period of appeasement, there's a lot of conversation that goes to the pointed fact that there was internationalist Bolsheviks who did infiltrate and who did subvert some parts of the Reichstag. And the other part of it is that we have to understand that the Anglo-American Empire was essentially creating these Hitlerian, Stalinistic, and even people such as Mussolini. Mussolini was on the take from the city of London. He had actually had a paycheck from them. And the other reasoning behind this is that people want to have some savior that's going to lift up their impotence, but then not only is that irrational, they're trying to find in this end of the world apocalyptic narrative another reason as to why they need to reject any political participation, any interaction with the other. And not only have we been bred into suspicion, the whole century of the 19th and 20th century was essentially that, the masters of suspicion, Freud and Nietzsche and Marx to some extent. And if you actually start reading, not that I am endorsing any particular ideologue, if you start reading some of these people, you realize that we've been under duress, under siege. The self has been under siege for a long time. And we've been accustomed to that. So we're always seeking for the next threat. We're seeking for the next person to save us as well. Here's the weird thing about irrational panic and irrational fear is that you tend to act irrational to meet that irrational fear. And when you do that, you're seeking to connect connections that are no longer there. And okay, so are we saying that Germany was the good guy in the Second World War? No, there was no idea of a good guy because we're dealing with countries, we're dealing with realpolitik. And if you know the history that Anthony C. Sutton puts forward, the city of London and Wall Street built up the Nazi regime. With what? With tech transfers, with funding, with direct funding. And then the individual also Hess, Karl Hess, I believe, he was trying to go make a pact with England because the deeper history there is that England wanted to use Germany to be a bulwark against communism. Now, they installed Stalin, and even the German intelligence brought in Lenin to Stalingrad, or I forget what the name of the city at the time was. But they brought him into Russia to, in that moment, to agitate and create the communist revolution. There's this thing that it's not only the Hegelian dialectic, it's Hegel just outlined what is the synthesis of history. But there are those people who use these abstract models to create history. And so they see themselves as the myth makers. They see themselves as creating these giant monolithic power centers like Germany, and then on the other end, Russia, and they fight against each other. But in Operation Barbarossa, when Germany invaded Russia, it was the most tragic mistake. But the reason behind that is because people were finding out that the English Empire was connected at the hip with Nazi Germany, and they did not want to be exposed to that. So they just agitated more tension and created more conflict, and the rest is history. But there are no good guys. There was no good guys in any fashion. I know it goes against history and the established belief of what history is. But yeah, I hope that answers some type of question. But I know people would want to know about Walt Whitman Rostow and others who were communists infiltrating the Theodore Roosevelt's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. That's That's confirmed, that's certifiable, that's actually evidence. But I think that this whole idea of the final hour, the long-term documentary, if you know this topic, you know this documentary. It's The Finest Hour, of the Betrayal of Germany. And Germany's betrayal did not start because of international Bolshevism. It started because of the leaders that was already installed. So the military industrial complex of Germany, they wanted to sacrifice their whole people to win worldwide victory over England, over others, because they wanted an empire as well. And Carol Quigley said the only thing about the collective unconscious of the German identity is that they themselves don't have an empire. So they're always lusting and seeking for an empire. And they were promised that in exchange for what? For following orders, for being part of the formation and going across the trenches. First 2 or 3 years, they did magnificently. But then as America continued, and obviously the creation of the Israeli state, this is where it connects to the Zionist interlopers who, through Jacob Rothschild and others, promised to get America involved in the First World War in order to bring a resolution to this ongoing total warfare. Okay, so that is why a lot of the people in this whole alternative right see the betrayal in the form of international Bolsheviks and Zionism against Germany. But rarely do they say this, that the Nazi SS, the secret intelligence, was working with Zionists to transport and immigrate thousands of Israelis into Palestine. How would that make sense that the top leaders are working with Zionists? They're all interconnected and they're playing a show, and there is no real stock into that. You're going to have to pay with your blood. And eventually, like Henry Kissinger said, military men are just dumb animals to be used as pawns in the grand chessboard. I think I should give it a pause here before I start going crazy.
Not going crazy at all, man. Yeah, obviously there's so much to explore on that subject, and many different scholars and books and thinkers, and so again, appreciate your take, man, in a short period of time. I don't know if we want to move a little bit into current events.
We could. So Joel, whatever you think.
Unless Joel's.
It's up to you, man. Like, do you feel like you have more to say on this topic? To me, it's very fascinating and intriguing. I mean, it's interesting watching the psychology flip to literally comparisons of like Hitler as this savior figure that was taken down. I've heard people say the idea that we're living in a world in which the good guys kind of lost, and now we're witnessing that play out. So it's all very, very interesting to witness. I know there's lots of different sources, lots of different arguments. Obviously, even the Holocaust has holes in that story as well. So I'm curious if you've got anything else to say on this before we move on.
Right. I'll give it 3 to 5 minutes and I'll try to go with it. And I do go extensively on this idea in conversation on my own personal research and podcast, but to the whole essence of it. All right. So the idea that the good guys lost is just an imposition because it is also the continuation of Alexander Dugin. People don't see this, but Alexander Dugin was also talking about the fourth position, but the revival of the communist superstate. And he has also admonished and celebrated people like Richard Spencer. And Richard Spencer and others consider themselves as neo-Bolsheviks. They reject liberalism. So we have to talk about the actual fracture or collapse, the gradual collapse of Soviet Russia, and how they created a long strategy of infiltration. But the current events actually connect to that, because honestly, if we're dealing with the actual people that were making the moves, we realize that they themselves were hijacked, they were compromised, and they also had the self-interest along the way of what they were doing. In Russia's contention in the Cold War against the United States, there was a development by Henry Kissinger, the Binational Scientific Foundation, where together with Mao and others, they directly started giving them technological transfer so they can start revitalizing the infrastructure, which creates a whole scenario of building up your enemies, right? And we've been doing that. The city of London, Black nobility, and Wall Street has been building up all these enemies and using the whole Hegelian dialectic to bring about the geopolitical effect that they want. So we're transitioning from unipolar world order to a multipolar world order, which is partly the reasoning of Alexander Dugin, who just so happens has been a very outspoken critic of the West and has been laying out this particular strategy out in a book for everybody to see, but we don't talk about it because it doesn't go towards the current exciting thing. If we believe that this dilemma happened today, then we're going to be thinking that our actions depend on immediate solutions. And then that comes to demagoguery, and then comes it all together. But the only real point I wanted to make is that the industrialization worldwide had different effects. Different people and cultures and communities and monopolies were taking their reins of power, and they were using it to implement and leverage their self-interest. And the psychology factor is more important because the emotional history is exactly how they get you to catapulted and prompted into acting into these agendas. And anyway, so yeah, let's get into the current things, and then eventually we get into that.
Cool, man. Well, what's happening currently?
What's happening? Tell us.
Okay, so what is happening now is that because there's a multipolar world order, we have to understand that there's new players.
Do you want to flesh that out a bit first? Multipolar world order.
Okay, definitely. After the Second World War, the IMF, NATO, and the United States were the principal power. They were the ones that were dominating not only with the currency, but with military might. They ran the whole world. And so in order for the reconstruction, it's very important that we understand that the Second World War had massive reconstruction contracts. And they were managed by the United Nations, the World Health Organizations, and others. But primarily, the movers and shakers of that policy was the United States and NATO. And they had the biggest army as well. They had the better technology. And so Russia was in the shadow of that. And they were trying to infiltrate and break it apart by what? Sending Russian Jews, supposedly, ostensibly, to Israel. And then Israel was being agitated by Bolshevik Jews who wanted to take over the country of Israel to make it more appropriate to them, to their cultural Soviet world. Now, as the United States became the more of a dominant world, they started getting into quagmires where people like Walt Whitman Rostow and others were basically trying to implement a realpolitik. So exactly like I said with Henry Kissinger, they started creating a realpolitik. Not only did they betray one another in their inner coteries, in the inner institution, they were betraying people, they were betraying leaders like Bashar al-Assad, his father. They betrayed him because they were trying to create a pan-Arabic state. Whenever there's a monolithic movement of people that come together, that's when you have a real problem, according to the realpolitik of the technocrats. So they also were in this whole political quagmire, and they ensnared Russia into an Afghanistan war, and a war in Afghanistan, which caused and expedited the end of their empire. And it created so much disaster that the collapse of the Russian system created almost like a whole century loss. Massive existential dread. All institutions, poverty, prostitution of all levels, especially with kids selling themselves in the street, all of that for years and years and years and years. And something of a fourth position started developing. And this was promulgated by Alexander Dugin. The whole idea is that there needs to be a revival of the communist Soviet bloc. And because of all these different ideas, that there will be eventually a time where the prestige and the empire of the United States will fall apart. What we're seeing here is that very same turn of events, where we're no longer seeing the relevance of NATO. We're no longer seeing the primacy, the supremacy of the dollar, which will give what? It gives an empty vacuum for other power dynamics to start taking shape. And those being Israel, Iran, China, Russia, India, and so on and so forth. And this is what we call BRICS. So we're experiencing a de-dollarization, And we've seen the outcomes of that with Gaddafi and others when they try to create a currency based on the gold system. But not only was Gaddafi creating a gold-backed currency, he was also creating a populist African movement. Again, when that happens, that's when there's bigger problems. It's about currency, it's about military, it's about the whole infrastructure, the whole financial infrastructure of the world. And that is what's happening. So Klaus Schwab has said we have to introduce a new system. There comes an opportunity for us to introduce a new system. Well, Amitai Etzioni says the same thing. If you haven't heard of Amitai Etzioni, he says this whole world needs a new infrastructure, a new system to meet the challenges of the future. So the collapse of the relevancy of the United States as a superior liberal system of democracy and empowerment, supposedly on their narrative, created a wedge and created an opportunity for all the Henry Kissinger and Associates and the fifth column groups to start taking over institutions like Princeton and others to really start working within these corporations and colleges and then start selling and transferring the information to a third party. And this is where we start approaching to the 90s. In the 90s, we started feeling more of a collapse because what we were feeling in the United States was the zenith, the peak of the hyper-real world that was the Reformation after the Second World War. There was a lot of political turmoil, and then it got glossed over because of the economic promise. So at the 1990, 1998, 2000, early on, the dot-com bubble, that really created more issues. But what the whole system was based on was on bailouts, not necessarily anything else, but bailouts. So that basically creates a glut, creates corruption, and then you have blackmailing operations happening in the background. And so all these politicians become compromised and they can no longer move or make any moves. And that is the relevancy of the United States gradually coming into nothing. And Yuri Bersnov talked about it. Yeah, there you go. But he didn't actually extensively put out the whole origin that originates even before communist Russia. And so as this fading empire, the main thing to remember of any empire, which is German or English empire or anything, while the power base might be destroyed, while the whole sectors of powers are destroyed, the industry, the technocratic elite who manage that model of control, they don't go anywhere. They don't just simply change. They simply change clothes and go to the next system, whoever's going to pay them. And these managers were able to move to the United States or Israel, somewhere else, and they were all being pimped out to figure out what's the next move. Well, the next move for Soviet Russia, as it was experiencing that collapse, is to essentially create a national sovereignty by a multipolar world order. And BRICS is not a military order, it's an economic order. So that's being refined as the zeitgeist continues. So a unipolar world order, to answer your question, is based on the NATO, American, liberal democracy. A multipolar world order is a regional power block. Regional power blocks. You have Eurasia, you have Africa, you have Europe. And guess who interconnects all those continents? Israel. So Israel has moved from the unipolar world order of being a protected state to being a partner in the international landscape. A partner to who? A partner to China, a partner to Russia. The technology that we gave to Israel was literally given to Mao Zedong and Vladimir Putin. Through who? Through Bibi Netanyahu, Havat Lubavitch, and others. They're the ones kind of engineering the transition. So what we're experiencing, in other words, is a transition to a new system of control and power. And the infrastructure is just shifting to the east. So I hope that it really defines what we're trying to talk here.
Yeah, man, it's a lot. There's obviously complexities to it. I'm doing my best to stay with you. I think I'm grasping what you're pulling at. So I guess to put it plainly for the people, does the current Republican movement represent a genuine potential resurgence of American values, powers, and ideals?
No, not even for 1 second. So I have to talk about this particular book because it's very important. Now, if you haven't heard of Leo Strauss, basically he is the godfather of conservatism. Once you do the actual ideological footwork and you follow what these people say, for example, I forget his name, but it'll come up in a minute. But the whole thing is that the parameters of culture, the parameters of society create a structure, if you will. And people from this French organization of interlopers were neo-Bolsheviks, but they didn't call themselves like that. They called themselves structuralists. And the whole point of structuralism is the way to manage a society is simply to create myths or parameters within with individual cultures and subcultures, and agents and citizens and others will choose these myths. They will choose these things and they will perpetuate it. And that is how we create reality. We're reality's actors, and we're simply reacting to their technocratic model of reality. And in essence, this whole idea of Leo Strauss and others basically is deconstructed what it meant to be a conservative. There's a reason why it's called neoconservatism, because their idea of freedom and actual enterprise is interconnected with monopolies. In another word of saying monopoly, it's an administrative unit run and managed by a centralized authority. That's communism. So all the stages of capitalism, whether it's just going from merchant capitalism to industrial capitalism to monopoly capitalism and financial capitalism, well, those structures will continue to grow, and the people in that class strata will continue to have a self-interest, and they're not going to give up their power. What we've discovered in the early 20th century is that the structures of power were still there, and they were not willing to let it go. They just simply changed costume. So the former people who were Trotskyites, or people who were of a different persuasion on how to run communism, they left. They left Russia. Trotsky was murdered in the city of Mexico, I believe, and I believe it was an Israeli-connected terrorist. I might be wrong about that, but the whole idea of why Trotsky left was because his ideas on how to manage a communist bloc were verboten. They were excluded. Now, he found a school of thought within the neoconservatives. The neoconservatives were actually looking into a lot of the issues in communist Russia and were developing these modern ideas on how to create a better society. But they were not saying we're here to liberate the individuals. The other part that we have to also understand is the theological. Now, the theological aspect of Judaism and Christianity, they are not necessarily congruent with Zionism. They're not congruent with these ideas of communism. Well, the people that are talking about conservatism usually just conserve what? They conserve monopolies. They conserve Israel. They conserve the corporation at the stake of what? Individual enterprise, free market. And so we want to believe that these neoconservatives are here to help us because it assuages our fear and our dread for the overcomplexification of society. And the myth makers, they know that. They've written extensive philosophical, psychological dossiers and memos on why the rationalization of a new justice system and why the new system is necessary. And it's almost laughable, but people do fall for it because it's about lip service. It's about labels. It's about slogans. I don't think it's anything else.
Yes.
So do you think?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, man. I mean, obviously, this isn't like my area of expertise, so like, I really enjoy everything you're saying here. But like, what are your thoughts on the upcoming election? You know, like with RFK Jr. Pushing for Trump. Like, what are your thoughts on all that?
I mean, the Team America, Musk, Trump, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, right?
Russell Brand, all these people who's now like hardcore Jesus, advocate. Like what's going on? Like, are people sitting in a boardroom, sketching out the plans of how this is going to go? Which some people think like, oh, that's not happening. Like, is there any level of organic movement behind this?
Who are the myth makers for this current storyline?
The myth makers. The myth makers are someone like, what's his name? I need to look it up. I had it. Karl Rove. There you go. Oh, I finally remembered.
Oh man, Karl Rove. Back in the days, I remember hearing his name.
Right, back in the day, right? But those people don't go away. Another myth maker is Roger Stone. Roger Stone is connected to Robert Steele. Robert Steele is connected to PSYOPs. He's connected to the State Department. They all are interconnected. So someone like Roger Stone is a myth maker because they create these mythos based on these heroes and icons, and people just simply follow up with them and they are prompted into action. But the deeper answer here is what COVID was really about. COVID is not necessarily about a medical lockdown, yes, but the actual conspiracy behind that conspiracy, it has to do with semiconductors, it has to do with Intel, and it has to do with Israel. Israel was having a big, difficult time with their semiconductor Intel. So another word of saying this is that Intel is now an Israeli corporation. Microsoft is an Israeli corporation. Now, a really good movie to look into is the Jason Bourne movie, the latest one, and where all the CIA agents are like, okay, they're in this whole administrative fusion center and they're able to dial up into everyone's psychological profile. We have to talk about automated manipulation and the whole age or the spirit of technocracy. I mentioned that the whole idea was to create a hyper-real landscape where people are inauthentic and have no idea on how to conduct a real engagement with reality. So what's going to happen is that there is a pseudo self that's been hijacked and now it's been abstracted into the internet. And with social management software, high-level social management software, you're able to tell what the human terrain is. The human terrain is ideas, beliefs, cultural norms, traditions, what you're more likely to do. So you can create models that you can gamify. And you can create these models so effectively that you can also predict how people are going to behave for a certain amount of time. And you can do this by completely psychoanalyzing the digital trail of everyone's life. Now, why that matters is because this doesn't obviously happen just in an informal way, but also in a formalized way. Informally, there's a superclass of interconnected individuals who have a will to power, an interest to continue the system because it benefits them, and they believe that they're the chosen ones. Either they're chosen by God, chosen by nature, chosen by the state, so on and so forth. These people are all thinking that they're actually participating in the building up of a new world. And this new world is smart cities. And these smart cities are based on what? Semiconductors, lithium, and other. That's how we're just going to start connecting it. So the main thing that helped Intel to be rescued from bankruptcy, guess what it was? COVID. Because everyone was in their computer connected and it allowed for everyone to work from home. And not only that, more people were consuming the surveillance grid and internalizing that. So that allowed to catapult a whole nexus of opposing or controlling dissidents. This is going to get really weird, and I don't want to get too weird.
You get weird, bro.
Let's get fucking weird, bro.
Okay. All right. Okay.
We're here for the weird, bro. We're here for the weird.
This is a yesteryear kind of conspiracy exposed. Now, I mentioned Robert Steele. I mentioned Roger Stone. Right. Well, if you...
He's very close to Trump, right?
Like this. Yeah. Right. Like this. But if we really look at the history from yesteryear, Roger Stone was into wife swapping. He was into a lot of weird bodybuilding cultural phenomenons. So early in the day, before Arnold Schwarzenegger really started making the whole bodybuilding scene as popular as it is today, well, it was really hard for you to get paid to do that. So you would have to have patrons. And these patrons were seemingly they were into the seedier aspects of life. And there is actually a name for us to follow. His name is Craig Titus. Now, Craig Titus, if you look him up, he was in Los Angeles. And he was part of this whole, bodybuilding cultural phenomenon. And he was actually one of the biggest ecstasy dealers in around that area. And some of the actual anecdotes about Titus is that he himself had received millions and millions of pills of ecstasy just like that. Well, as it turns out, many of these individuals are federal informants, and they go and snitch on each other to prevent getting arrested. Well, that whole subplot is just like celebrities today, where you have Diddy doing the whole blackmailing operation. It's the same thing with bodybuilding. And the key word is financial starvation and leveraging that to create informants. And these informants were actually participating not only for the government, but also for secret intelligence communities. And now, as we get deeper into it, Roger Stone has this association with this young bodybuilder who is called Guru and is connected to this other guy. I don't want to say these things because it's just going to get distracted, but essentially what they were into is into methamphetamine, ecstasy, and sexual proclivities that are actually not quite traditional. And he was caught in the 1990s. He was caught wife swapping because he put in an ad for his wife to seek, masculine men to service her. So this goes deeper too. And his strategy to avert that was 3 words: deny, deny, deny. So he came up with that. So throughout that time, the banking mafia had chosen Trump to be a commodity. So the bigger part of Trump's success is not that he was successful in business, but he had the hyper real image of success. So the bankers, they knew he couldn't pay his debt. So they said, we'll do you a favor. You continue being this real estate magnate, centralizing resources and creating monopolies, and we'll let you be the Donald Trump label. So that was so interconnected. And then comes other parties into this whole coterie of insiders. Deeper and deeper they go. Then comes the blackmailing operations from Israel, where they started interconnecting with many of these circles that Roger Stone was working with. And then comes into today of what we're talking about, this new nexus of supposed controlled dissidents like Sean Atwood. I'm going to say that name. That's the last time. Because if you guys notice in the whole COVID lockdown, all out of nowhere, there was a resurgence of all these dissident individuals who seemingly had the right connections, had the right guests, and you guys have done a show. You know how hard it is to get the right guests, get the right people, because you have to go through the whole network of people. And so Sean Atwood came out of nowhere as a dissident. And guess what? He has the same profile. What is that profile? Oh, ecstasy dealer he's known as the English nerd or the English gentleman who was all over there in England. And all of a sudden he was in Arizona. And then he was protected by the Mexican cartel. And then you go deeper into it, he was actually a federal informant working for U.S. authorities. And that's how he was protected. And once you go deeper into his proclivities of drugs and sexual proclivities that are not decent, well, you're going to start realizing that there's a whole MO, there's a whole profile of people that they're choosing to put in front of us. Well, guess what? Sean Atwood was said by Robert Steele that he is one of the good ones. Really good interviewer. He should be the model for everyone. And at that time, Alex Jones and others were talking about the bigger conspiracies and the takeover, but they wouldn't talk about the technological transfer. They wouldn't talk about the infiltration and the actual Unit 8200 conducting national security agencies' business. Basically, we transfer the whole security apparatus and we gave it to Israel. And in that whole motion, no one was actually talking about that. We were just simply talking about the whole idea of what COVID and the usual suspects were. Well, as you keep connecting Sean Atwood, Robert Steele, Roger Stone, Shadowgate, all of these things you look into, you're going to start realizing there's a deeper game being played. Well, then at that time, Whitney Webb was also talking about all of these conspiracies. And unfortunately, we have more of an interest with limited hangout agents than actually going to the information. The issue with Whitney Webb is that her approach doesn't extensively go into the deeper root of this problem. She had information about this technological transfer from Brendan O'Connell. Now, Brendan O'Connell, the alternative media never told me about it. I was following them every single day, and I was like, what? Brendan O'Connell? Who is he? Well, it turns out Brendan O'Connell is one of the most formidable voices about the Talpio program. And that's corporate espionage. That's the infiltration of institutions, the infiltration of the military, and deeper. So Brendan O'Connell had a major whole resource of this particular information that he gave to Whitney Webb. Literally, there's the images, there's the whole resources. And Whitney Webb's response is, I'm too busy, I'm looking into some other things. But the things that she was looking into was the national security state and the State Department, and basically the CIA did it. But when you look at it, that's a limited hangout. How can the CIA do it if they've been infiltrated and we've been literally paying them off, the Israeli and other Russian Jews, to run our systems? They didn't name that name. They didn't. Now it's convenient because people are making the connections. And so these people, these nexus of alternative media controlled dissidents, they're being pushed for what reason? To continue the agitation, to continue the spiritual confrontation that they're seeking. One thing that they're trying to do is essentially leverage the messianic prophecy of authentic Judaism and use that as a camouflage to create the McKinley world island. But there's also the leafer cloth. The idea is, because Israel is in the middle of Africa, Europe, and Eurasia, then that in itself is like a clover leaf. It allows for it to be the center of the new world. So in essence, the critical information that could help people inform them and snap out from this conditioning of infiltration was not told to them by Whitney Webb and others like Sean Atwood. They were too busy becoming popular. They were too busy pretending that they were the opposition. And now Whitney Webb presents their information with my evil twin, Derek Bros, and they're going to be telling us all the truth that we haven't said and, all the current things that we need to know about. But the history, going back to it, doesn't really matter anymore because we all are trying to be superstars and pretend to be dissidents. That's the biggest problem here. We have people believing and pretending that they're dissidents, and they're wanting to be the spotlight, and they don't actually want to solve problems because they're only fixed to the current thing. And the current thing is connected to automated manipulation. So you're not going to make any money if you're not talking about this current thing. If you're not talking about the parameters within this current conversation, then you're not going to participate in the overall money for clicks. I think that this...
Well, the algorithm's not going to support it, which ultimately is going to lead to the paycheck at the end of the day. But is that enough reason to lead to the conclusion that someone's an agent?
Financial starvation is a difference. It does have a real impact on the psyche, but no, it's not. The actual reality is that Whitney Webb's father is a multi-million-dollar corporate lawyer that is connected to these people. There's a deeper sense. It's not only, we're talking about a psychoanalysis of someone who has unethical practices and has been turned into a federal informant and then works to perpetuate the whole system of ideas. Well, yeah, there is a profit motive, but there's also the motive to be bigger than oneself. Then there's also the motive to be protected from the consequences of all the actions that they've taken. Is Whitney Webb a control agent? Possibly not. Does she have ulterior motives? I definitely do believe. One of the case studies for us to really look into and criticize is Julian Assange. So once we look into WikiLeaks, all have they done primarily what Julian Assange was interested in. This came out in the Manafort documents. What he was interested in was, how do we take this truth and direct it as a criticism to U.S. imperialism? So if we're talking about Julian Assange was based in Australia, and he was based with the whole hacker revival in the 1990s.
He has weird cult family ties.
Exactly. The white hair is a big, big tale. But the thing about it, besides the cult connections, is that he was working for the Department of Information in Australia. I forget what the name of the actual department is, but they had found out that they were fracking or cracking the State Department's database and other security databases in the US. And these people, these guys, they sold each other out, and they started working with the state. And then they started working with the secret intelligence. And then they started working in bigger echelons of power, not as representatives of their free will, but as puppets that are controlled and are used only to move the agenda and to create a confusion and conflict. It's a very confusing state of affairs, but I think the main thing that keeps people plugged in is that they're looking for an external hero that tells them the lip service that they want, and they simply want to resolve this big time issue because it is a big, complicated issue. But because it's such a end of the world apocalyptic tale, people are just going to clamor to whoever offers them immediate solutions. And Donald Trump has given some form of those solutions, but then why are we supporting the very person that promoted and expedited vaccines, experimental vaccines that harm people through Operation Warp Speed? Think of that mind hijack. That's an interesting state of affairs right there. Why are we choosing him? Well, because he's being imposed to us in a selection season, and because we see the end of the American world order as an existential threat. And in order for us to really account for that, we're going to have to realize that the last 100 years were a major conscious compliance in that system. And that's a lot for people to process.
Yeah. Hector, today happens to be 1 year since the, Israel-Palestine incident. How does that relate to everything that we've been talking about so far?
So Benjamin Netanyahu had previous knowledge of the October 7th attack. He had knowledge. I'm not talking from alternative media sources. I'm talking from Haaretz. I'm talking from Israeli Times. And the biggest thing that was an issue is the liberal left in Israel. They are sick and tired of having Benjamin Netanyahu just do whatever it takes to continue his power. So he preemptively allowed for that attack to happen because it will create an agenda to continue the greater project. What is the greater project? Greater Israel. A greater Israel in the Levant. They want to take over these different countries, but in order to do that, they need Hezbollah and others to do stupid moves that will not help their geopolitical situation and would allow them to use that as a leverage or as a false flag to perpetuate their system. And the thing about the October 7th attack, it really started showing the weakness of Israel because they're very powerful, but they're powerful because they have the kill switch. They have God mode enabled for all microprocessors in Microsoft and others. That's what makes them to have such a hubris, because they understand that they can have the kill switch and create an EMP scenario and destroy things. So it's not that they're going to allow for October 7th just because they're trying to win one particular battle. It's because it's a whole series of events that will take them to the overall project of greater Israel. That's the whole nexus of it. They're trying to create that. And, once we're actually talking about Israel and Palestine, well, we want to talk about who did this and who did that. Well, unfortunately, historically, all the prime ministers of Israel originate from Poland, originate from Ukraine, and some parts of Eurasia. They're not even actual Semitic people. They're Bolshevik revolutionaries who installed themselves in Israel. And even David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister who visited Russia, he said, I'm a Bolshevik. And then the deeper game into it is war through deception. We need to continue catapulting the evangelical Christians and the conservatives into this mythos that would allow us to continue building a greater Israel project. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but there's a lot of reports from Haaretz and others that really speak to it. And it's kind of confusing because if you look at the alternative media outside of Israel, we want to deem all of Israelis and Jews as evil and bad, but little do we know that anti-Semitism actually helps Zionism. This is the whole point. The October 7th helps them to continue and perpetuate war. And anyway, please, let's continue with this conversation. I do not want to get caught in the cul-de-sac. It's so confusing sometimes to just be talking about labels without context.
So would you say it's kind of like overly simplistic to come at it from the perspective of, Israel is the country in the Middle East that holds the most Western values, and the greater fear is Islamic values and ideals taking a rise, and so that we need to then, create a bulwark and put our support behind Israel simply based on this notion of preferred ideas?
Sometimes I want to buy these people a coffee and just sit them down and be like, all right, you're going to listen to me for 2 hours, because it's not optimistic. It's delusional. It's not optimistic. It's delusional. Delusional because the idea that they themselves are creating a bulwark resistance of pan-Islamic revival, as in the Ottoman Empire, is ridiculous when you actually realize that IDF runs Hezbollah, that IDF is actually managing in person a lot of these terror groups. And when always they get exposed, they just change costume. But here's a little political reality for us. Before the Islamic issues of, massive immigration from the Middle East because of Syrian imposition and the Syrian conflict, well, Israel and some of their outspoken progenitors of this greater Israel project, they were saying, just you wait, Europeans and Americans, you're going to have a whole series of Islamic terror attacks, as if predicting something that was going to happen, and it's so obvious. And then inevitably that happened, and it just seemingly helped the greater Israel project. No, it's not possible to think of them as the preservers of Western values, because the whole leadership, this is from Israel, Times of Israel and Haaretz, where they're talking that they're sick and tired of here's the irony, that Israelis are sick and tired of dual citizens from Russia coming into their Knesset and taking over their institutions and taking them to more war. That's why they were experiencing a big popular uprising the previous year on October 7th, because they were sick and tired of all that. And no, it's in fact kind of erroneous, but it's actually a very interesting, sophisticated hijack. And Ben Shapiro talks about as if Israeli Jews are the ones that are basically running the whole Western cultural tradition. And if we do without them, well, the end of the West comes about. But never mind the demographics and the whole complicity of the neoconservatives and also the liberals were taking us to a deeper quagmire that is not going to help us in any way. So how is an existential threat originating from a conflict that should not be going to help preserve American values? It doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if you have an ideology. It only makes sense if you're seeking to create a whole narrative that is purposeful in its mythos creation, and the whole purpose of it is the outcome, the creation of their empire. That's what they're seeking, and a creation of a greater Israel empire.
Yeah. Do you think Israel was behind 9/11?
Well, we have to discuss it in the faction of intelligence communities, because we have not only the dancing Israelis, but we have the companies that were literally days and months before that were mover companies that were just so happy to wear the costume of movers, and they were infiltrating the World Trade Center and installing bombs. There's actual evidence of this, and they were stopped by a police officer. I forget in what type of bridge they were stopped, and they were interrogated after the fact, and they were saying, "What were you doing here?" And the police officer who were investigating these people realized that it had an Israeli accent. They had Israeli papers and documentation, and people forgot about that. But there's a deeper plot, because in September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld, who's connected to these people and others, David Axelrod, Eric Emanuel, and many people, but they were in essence trying to figure out how to create a whole project of the new American century. That's what the conservatives believe. But they're being catapulted into this Middle East quagmire by Israeli agents. It's not just the Israelis. They also were the Germans and others that were involved in this massive conspiracy. But yes, I do tend to the conclusion that Israel was involved, but it's only possible to be involved in that massive operation if you have fifth column groups operating with the United States, which is the bigger puzzle here.
Yeah. What's a fifth column group?
Okay, so in Spain, we had all these different contingencies of political power blocks. We had the fascists, we had the liberals, we had the anarchists, we had the communists, we had the socialists. And they were all trying to fight for control of where the civil war was going to unfold and take shape. Well, international bankers infiltrated these subversive groups and started paying them off to act in accordance with an agenda. Well, it was colloquially known as fifth column to have these infiltrated international groups pretend to be part of the overall grouping of authentic dissidents. So in other words, fifth column groups are just interlopers pretending to be part of the solution, which is what we have all the time. We have all these people who talk lip service towards free market, and they end up talking about monopolies all the time or protecting corporations.
Real quickly, I just want to go back because I had
just to simplify, a fifth column group refers to a group or movement within a country or organization that secretly works to undermine it from within, often in collaboration with external enemies. It's commonly used to describe individuals or factions who covertly support an outside force or ideology with the intent of weakening or sabotaging the entity they ostensibly belong to.
Ostensibly is the key word. They're ostensibly Jewish. They're ostensibly conservatives. They're ostensibly liberal. But their actions really, you start dictating someone's fruitage, the outcome of their labor.
Only because I brought up his name before and you didn't comment on it specifically. Like RFK Jr.'s role in a lot of things going on. Obviously, he's been, speaking out for years on vaccines, and there's this whole RFK Trump, collaboration to, make America healthy again. So like, again, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're introducing, they're trying to go back to the legacy of what it meant to be a candidate and use that to catapult a new system of thought leaders. And the connection of RFK, I started hearing a lot about his anti-vaccine rhetoric and his issues about experimental vaccines. But the thing as to his relevancy to this whole system, what makes RFK Jr. relevant today? His advocacy towards freedom and natural products, and his advocacy towards Trump and others. But the deeper game here is pretending or to be someone of the solution and then selling your goods. That doesn't have to be so complicated sometimes. Sometimes it's actually just right there and forward. They're trying to continue to be relevant, to push the mechanism of power so that it can allow the next chapter where they want to be. RFK was not seriously entertaining a presidency run. It's the same thing again and again. You use the idea or the running for a presidency as a platform to push an idea as an inception to continue the mechanism of power. The whole idea of mythos is not just one individual, but what that individual is playing as a role in the ecosystem. And I think Amazing Polly might do a better job of this because she's been talking about it for a bit. But there's these health companies that are in the back of these conservative ideologues, and they're all interconnected, and they're trying to pump out these products and even come in with cryptocurrency and even install a whole new system that will revitalize democracy. So his role is still not there, but it will come into vision once Trump is actually selected. And one thing we have to understand is whether Trump is against them or not, they will use him when it benefits him. The same thing with RFK. The system will use these individuals when it benefits them. They continue to allow them to have their spiel because in some form, it introduces what they want the population to focus and talk about.
So you're saying that these individuals might not be consciously aware that they're, let's say, I am controlled opposition, but they're just being used to push something forward.
Exactly. So, for example, like some of these people that have been talking about the narrative, they themselves are not getting, I'm not estimating or deducing that someone like Whitney Webb is getting her command and control orders from some secret space agency. No, I'm saying they have sort of an informal incentive to continue discussing these things. And because of the nexus of automated manipulation and the reality that we live in, well, it actually does help in some form. Some of these issues are dealt quietly. Some of these issues happen in the Department of State. Some of these issues play out in the Pentagon. And sometimes some of these technocratic elite allow for this information to play out because they want to leverage it and use it. But yeah, some of these people, even though there might be limited hangouts, are not actually participating as marching orders from the elite. To your point, you're right.
Many people would listen to a conversation like this and say, Hector, you're completely black-pilled. You got RFK on TV talking about, questioning vaccines, questioning GMOs, encouraging people to eat healthy again, et cetera, et cetera. So a couple of questions, what positives do you see from our trajectory, and what would you say in response to people that might label your thoughts as black-pilled?
That's funny because I've never, I've never been called that. But okay, we need to use
It usually comes out when you start questioning, any positives that Trump and his regime might.
Well, and also we're highlighting all the problems.
Yeah.
We're like what's going on right now, and it's like, okay, well, what are the positives? What are the solutions?
Okay, definitely. So we have to use the zeitgeist and the momentum of all these trajectories, not as distancing ourselves from political action, but using the momentum explicitly when it approaches us to change hearts and minds. So some of them are like, for example, Talpiot Talk and others, they try to go to the actual conservative conventions and the liberal conventions to start preaching the word of what's happening, the tech transfer, the actual bastardization of America, and the insiders that are doing that. We have to realize that we cannot allow for these beacons or icons to take the reins just by happenstance and us becoming spectators. Going back to the idea of impotence, the idea of impotence is cooked into the pie with conspiracy theories, because we're creating, not us necessarily in this conversation, but the whole hijack of conspiracy theories creates these inhuman, alien, super powerful individuals that we cannot do anything about. But when we actually think about it, there are people that have a self-interest, and we can understand their emotional history and make connections. So in other words, really, what I'm suggesting that people do is localize their reality and practice skepticism, a healthy, balanced skepticism that does not go into neurotic cynicism, but feel into what you can do as an individual. There is a moment where synchronicity and extraordinary individuals come together and makes history. There's so many examples of that. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but if you're in the right time, in the right place, you can make a lot of changes. But what's even more important, when you're in the right mindset and you're interconnected to the time, to the spirit of the time, you develop an intuition to that. And when you develop an intuition, you don't have to plug into what is Russell Brand pretending to be today. You start realizing, oh, so they really are trying to create an ideological spiritual warfare, and they also want us to believe into these things. But what if I do believe in some type of Christianity, and I do believe in some type of revival between Israel and others, but how about feeling into my localized reality? How about developing an intuition? And that will guide us more contextually than looking and chasing after every conspiracy. The whole point is to demoralize you to such an extent that you're impotent. But honestly, after realizing all this information, I have been more motivated and more self-driven because it helped me to understand that my actions do have a consequence, but I mean that in a positive sense. That if I'm taking my time and energy to simply stay back, watch others talk, and lead me, my actions are impotent. But if I use the information and actually individuate to create that connection with myself and the other, well, I've already created a lot of work, and that can be a contextual footing for us to realize where we want our country, where we want our government and our state. Even talking about those things are very abstract. But if you can think about some of the momentum and the political solutions that we've had, well, there's a lot of power for us. And in fact, why not message these people? Why not keep them accountable? So if there's a Donald Trump in office and he's believing about America first, and other people like RFK Jr. are supporting that, well, let's keep them accountable. Let's keep on checking them. Let's keep providing the counter narrative for them to be cohesive and uniform in what they're saying. I feel people just want to lay back, let others take the reins of reality, and then, okay, I guess I'll just do my little life and nothing will change.
Yeah. Really hit spot on. I mean, of course, bro, like who wants to really be involved to that level? Who really wants to, and plus, man, like, people just don't have the time, affluence to prioritize these things properly, I think.
Yeah, the financial starvation is purposeful, the economic imposition. I mean, because we live in a complex world. I'm not saying to change the whole world. I'm saying change your world, connect with it, And that is an outgrowth of spontaneous order. So we want established command and control. We want brutal but effective policies. And then when you tell them, well, what's the alternative? What's the actual solution? Spontaneous action and spontaneous order. Well, what is that? Well, that's when people actually choose to localize and individuate and connect with reality. And in that essence becomes a spontaneous solution. It's not fantasy. It's actually quite psychological.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you there, man.
No,
Sure.
I mean, it's everything that Joel and I talk about and preach about, you know, in terms of, you know, coming back into your own power, building self-esteem, connecting more to your intuition, knowing what you value and creating that in your world, you know. And I mean, like, you can't solve every fucking problem that's going on in the world, but like, what can you do to influence, you know, yourself, your family, your local community, and then what comes from that? What relationships are built, what new creations come about because, you know, you listen to some inner calling and you connected with someone new. I mean, again,
the more that I like hear conversations like this and just the depth and the complexity and the history and the fucking layers of it, like the more I'm inclined to be like, why does it fucking matter? You know, why does it,
I hear you.
Like, why does it matter in terms of like, there's no hope, or why does it matter?
Why should it matter to me? Like, I'm here, I've got creative energy flowing through my bones. I've got certain passions, which I want to get to, you know, it's like, why does this deserve my attention? Is like, what I mean, more than why does it matter? Yeah.
Right. And we also play a complementary role in reality. I mean, for me, I love doing a particular type of research as a matter of just intellectual curiosity.
And you're amazing at it.
And I love it, and it's what I like. And other people might be interested in creating art or producing videos or producing businesses, but it's the whole objective in reality for us to create it.
Yeah.
The moment we realize that we can actually change reality, well, that's a lot of power for people. They don't want that.
Most people, man, maybe not ones that have been fully like indoctrinated or conditioned, but most people, man, they have that inner calling, that whisper of the thing that they're drawn to bring forth in the world. It's like, whether or not they're doing it or not, that's a whole another conversation. But like, it's like you're born in this, you're this unique being. Like, you're drawn to things or you're not drawn to things. You're drawn to books. You're drawn to like classes to take. You're drawn to different types of people. Like, it's like there's something internal that's guiding you there. Now, whether or not you honor that, to go against the herd, to go against your family, to go against your social group, you know, that's up to the individual. But like, when I think about my life, there's been some intuitive nudge that guides me to the people, the places, and the things that I think, you know, excite me and light me up and that I want to keep evolving from. So, I mean, that's the message. That's the message. Like, go do the thing that you're lit up by, that excites you. Pick up the fucking book, read it, put down your phone, put down the fucking doom scrolling, read a book, feed your mind, feed your soul, hug someone that like you care about and you love, you know, plant a fucking tree.
Yeah.
And on the other end, the whole conspiracy is to get us away from that into this spectacle. That's the whole point of the conspiracy. For you to forsake and forget that, the intuitive feeling, and to just betray that, and then you start betraying the other, and then you're finally inside the realm of power, and now you could be a cog. Now you can continue exercising your will to power.
Yeah. We have a little bit of time left. I know you're making a more of a personal move towards getting back into journalism in a deeper way. You're looking into Latin America and things like that. Can you speak on that briefly?
Yeah, definitely. So like I mentioned to you earlier, I am going to be embarking on next conference in Mexico City called Monerotopia. And it's based on the cryptocurrency Monero, but my whole staging of that and the idea I'm going into is because the main problem in Latin America is that it's completely subverted by Mossad. It's completely subverted by Israel. In fact, we're not even allowed to have our own technological manufacturing. We don't even have our own bank. And Televisa, one of the biggest Mexican news networks and shows.
That's Tel Aviv.
Yeah. Well, exactly. They're the biggest Zionist supporters of all, right? And then unfortunately, we start thinking like, well, what do you mean? What does Israel has to do with Latin America? Drug trafficking, organ trafficking, sex trafficking, so much. extensively. But there's a different thing going on there too, that Israel has this non-governmental organization called Backpackers Without Borders. And so they're installing their non-governmental organizations to kind of bring in people to certain sites, certain places. And I'm going to be reporting on it and actually been expounding on this idea of why the multipolar world order is going to spotlight Latin America, specifically because Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina are replete with lithium. And here's the funny thing that a lot of us, and I love free market, I love the individualism, I love it. I cannot go without it. I do not want collectivist, shadows to take over my identity. But the one thing that I just find deplorable, because of the Anglo-American lexicon, most people's idea of what is happening in Latin America is by controlled media channels that are run by Israel and the United States. So they don't actually know that Milei, the greatest anarcho-capitalist president that there ever was sending the gold of Argentinians to the city of London. So that's a big, big news story that was broken by no one in the alternative media, where Milei sent gold of Argentina to the city of London. And then the Falklands is going to play a big role into this. The reason I'm moving into Latin America in general is because I'm also doing some projects there. But the essence of it, it's very difficult to be an actual reporter and journalist there because of the violence and everything that entails. But my whole idea is the technocratic assimilation of Mexican identity, because there's this book, Forever Mañana, that basically dovetails or deconstructs what it means to be a Mexican. And the idea of individuality is a rugged, archaic belief system in Aztec mythology. One of these things is that bigger picture is the new president, obviously she's Jewish, and somehow, some way she's elected, and the whole liberal left has taken over the presidency, but it's not the actual liberal left as we imagine it. And the major problem here is that Mexico has been invaded like 14 times, 13 to 14 times. There's a museum where of all the political impositions and infiltrations of the United States of Mexico. And the whole reason behind that is that people don't understand that this is going to get a little bit personal. The new city, the new development, because of devolution of power in the multipolar world order, the state is no longer as relevant as it used to be. Well, there's a new rise of independent cities. And guess what? These independent cities are global smart grid cities. What are they? Oh, they're built on all these infrastructure that is connected to Wall Street and City of London. And they're going to have their own particular constitution. They're all going to have their particular laws. And why is that a bigger issue? Imagine if someone in the United States decided to create an independent city who had no allegiance to the actual land of the law there, but they're connected to the City of London, they're connected to Wall Street. How will people react when their water resources and their mining resources are taken over by internationalists? Well, that's what the story that I'm going to be talking about, and also going to be doing some hearts and minds to the point of being black-pilled. I'm very excited and very happy, but I do feel like if you're just talking about it and just removing yourself from it, you're going to feel that sourness. But if you do meet with people and connect with them and inspire them, it's going to be great.
And that's the difference between the black pill label. It's like, what is the motivation behind it? What's the state of your nervous system as you explore these subjects, as you research these subjects, as you share these subjects? It's one thing to like report on something matter-of-factly versus like, we're all gonna fucking die. The world's ending. It's a little different there.
And we all do it sometimes. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no, I get it. We
do it because we want to prompt people. Like, hey, this is a very serious thing. So you gotta do it.
I want to, because you brought up lithium a couple times. Obviously, recently there were natural so-called disasters in North Carolina, Tennessee, and other places, and there's a lot of stuff coming out. People are like posting online, like, this mining company, purchased a permit, and because there's like, it's the only place that there's a certain kind of material that is used for semiconductors or whatever. So I'm curious, can you talk on that a little bit? I know we're running out of time, but I just want to highlight that.
I'll be quick. I actually had some suspicions of it because, you can start realizing what the next thing is going to be. One of the most popular city, Asheville, a lot of liberal Democrats went into Asheville, and the biggest political resistance towards any corporate exploitation of resources is usually from the left. And it's not because I'm like lionizing them, but because that's usually typically true. And then the idea of the response, people want to say, well, they're actively doing a whole Katrina where they're not actually helping people. Well, you have to realize that these organizations and institutions, they're centralized. So obviously they're not going to work well, and they're not supposed to work well, because centralization of resources is the most ridiculously stupid thing you can do, because you're not actually appealing to human agency, the individual, rational individual, but you're dealing with centralized command and control of bureaucracy. So there's that aspect of the response. Definitely there's a lot of issues there, and there are private individuals who are coordinating a response, and that's what the free market's about. But because the whole state needs to create dependency, they're not going to allow for that. And then comes the idea of weather weapons. Lyndon Baines Johnson said this: whoever controls the weather controls the world. And so that is actually factually true. And it's not even about cloud seeding. We're in 2024. They have more powerful modulation waves to create a different disastrous event. But we have to look at it in a geopolitical fashion, because the geopolitical fashion of it is weather weapons can be used as vectors to multiply force. And we can originate, we cannot trace it. This is the unfortunate part. We can trace the evidence. There is American experimentation on the weather. There is all these other countries doing it. That's factual. There is other people being affected by this, and they're not being helped by the government. But the main thing that I have an issue is the oversimplification. We're dealing with a major catastrophe that was made worse by the government. Major because the whole nexus of ideas needs to make it major in order to create a catharsis to move people. It's all about displacing people and then creating a new system. Now, the bigger problem here is what is going to happen to the actual city of Asheville and others. What's going to happen in the reconstruction? That's when we're actually going to finalize the conclusion. If we see a whole smart city grid buildup, then we can confirm definitely this is a projected plan and it happened. If you're asking me intuitively what I believe without any actual real hardcore evidence, I think that they did it on purpose, and they did it to maximize a whole effect and create a new system. Here's the bigger picture, and I just want to say this immediately. It's not about the event itself. It's the opportunity that it creates to recreate the independent city and then interconnect that into the smart city grid. So whether they did it or they didn't do it, one thing we can really conclude: they're going to use this as an opportunity to leverage a new whole system, and they're going to let the whole infrastructure of this country break down so that they can leverage that and perpetuate the new system. So yeah, in a way, I can't prove that it was the technocratic elite. I do have a suspicion, but the idea is we're tracing something that is so anonymous and speculative that we really have to focus on the outcome of it. So the outcome looks very suspicious.
Well, it's interesting too, because like last 2 years in like the Los Angeles area, we've been fucking just battered with rain, man. Like just on crazy amounts of rain, and I'm like there's got to be something maybe a little bit more sinister or experimental around this. I just like went online and just Googled like cloud seeding Los Angeles, and there was an article from, I think it was past January, that like they're doing cloud seeding experiments to increase precipitation by 15%. So it's not like some hidden thing, you know, that like is happening under wraps. Like it's like an ABC News article talking about cloud seeding, and then all of a sudden we have these crazy amounts of rain, nonstop downpours for like 2-3 days straight that cause flooding and landslides and things of that nature in a place that was considered, you know, a little bit more droughty.
Right. And so that's why I wanted to establish that these things are factual, but we can put it in, we can't source it as effectively as we want, because cloud seeding is an operation that has happened from the 1960s, 1970s. Their operations are way more sophisticated. Yeah. And then we have to think about the geopolitical context. There is weather warfare. They're using weather as a vector. That's also part of it. But what I think is less difficult for us to understand is that whether we agree or disagree, the alchemical procession continues. So whether we simply put this as a weather weapon on North Carolina, the whole essence of it will carry over to the new system. I'm more concerned with the essence of the system. And I know what's going to happen just because the essence of it tells me. Maybe this is presumptuous, but I think that we need to create a more substantial dialectic that is not necessarily based on pattern recognition, which I understand it's very important. But if we get the context and the substance, then we can start making a better approach, and then we get into the chasing the patterns. Just my opinion.
Thank you, man. Thank you for sharing
man.
your opinions. Thank you for sharing your research. I think our audience is going to absolutely love this episode. I think you speak on things that most people aren't having access to at all, and the alternative media.
Yeah, man, for sure. Just grateful for you to be, to be building a connection and be part of the network and to get your takes and to be able to share that with our people. I think it's very unique, nuanced, and, it's coming from a perspective and an angle, like Erasmus said, that most people aren't really privy of or probably aren't willing to go to for various reasons. So much love to you, man. But just in general, like, what would you like to share with our audience in terms of, how they can connect with you to a greater degree?
Okay, so if you want to support my philosophical research and be part of the process and developing it or getting an inside scoop, the best place for you to support me is through patreon.com/dungeonmaster. But if you also want to participate in the next staging of where I'm going, I recommend you meet me in Monerotopia, happening November 14th to the 18th. And you can use the promo code COMBO24. It's almost like a commercial. But the reason I want people to meet me there is I am going to be engaging with some of the deeper solutions, and I want to promulgate that and follow through. I really appreciate you guys for offering me the platform to speak into these things, because they are difficult to talk about, especially if you have ulterior motives and biases.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Dude, what can I say? Thank you for being you. Thank you for being here for the truth. Everyone else, thank you so much for listening. Take care.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Here for the Truth. Just want to mention as a final call to action and a shout out, there's 2 days left for the next round of Rise Above the Herd. This is our 11th time running the program. It starts October 15th. So if you feel the call and the pull to be part of this round and you're ready to pick up the phone and answer what's ringing and come face to face with what's in your way, then we'd love to see you inside our 10-week psycho-spiritual program for truth seekers to really unleash their power and step into deeper authenticity in their lives, because I think that's everyone's birthright. You can head to riseabovetheherd.co or hit the link in the bio.
Smoking mirrors, I'm seeing through the illusion. Waking up in a time they think you're in a delusion. Somebody set the alarms, cause they be too busy snoozing. I'm in a DeLorean, fast forward and evolution.